The day I arrived back home, the rain was pouring down. It wasn't a difficult or dramatic storm. Everything feels heavier because of that sluggish, chilly drizzle that seeps into your bones. In addition to the cold, I knew what was waiting for me inside, which is why my fingers were shaking. My coat was too thin, and my shoes were saturated. It was my mother's memorial. When my stepfather eventually texted me 2 days prior, he had described it as a small party. Only a select few will remember her. I only received that, a message. There was no phone call. How are you doing then? No check-in. All you need is a time, an address, and a heads up to prevent any delays. I didn't arrive late. However, nobody took notice of me. When I entered the living room, I saw faces I knew from years ago, as well as neighbors, distant cousins, and former coworkers. They were all sipping tea, muttering condolences, and smiling graciously. Then there came my stepfather, tall and dapper in his just-ironed suit, standing by the fireplace and talking like a bereaved widower on autopilot. Not a single tear. He avoided looking at me. Not even when I passed him directly. For a few seconds, I waited in the doorway, hoping that someone, anybody, would see me. Say hi. Nod at me. But they didn't nod. They glanced over me as if I were a piece of wallpaper. A woman is wiping the rain from her sleeves. I was not given a chair. I looked around the room and saw that every seat was occupied, but not accidentally. Name. Cards had been inserted, relatives, friends, and family. There was even a place for his coworker's daughter. Not me, though. In my mother's house, I stood in the corner like a stranger. It was the house where I was raised. I remember running through the house in my bare feet and laughing as she prepared soup in the kitchen. She taught me how to write my name in the kitchen. She used to touch my hair and tell me that I was her tiny bit of enchantment while we watched thunderstorms together. Right now, I hoped no one would ask me to move as I stood close to a dusty ficus plant. He was the first to speak as the service began. My stepfather. Catherine was the love of my life, he continued, clearing his throat as he stood up. She gave me everything. A house, a household, an excuse to continue. I took a bite out of my cheek. He pointed to his niece, who had always been more like a daughter to him than I ever was, and said, "She raised Olivia as if she were her own." I didn't flinch at all. I had discovered not to. It still hurt, though. He talked endlessly about her kind nature, her intense love, and how she united this family. She didn't introduce me to this family, though. Her family was mine, and I was the outsider now, somehow. No one asked me to speak. Nobody even gave me a glance. Then I noticed it while they were passing around a photo book. This is a brand new album, printed by professionals. Leather-bound, dedicated to Catherine Monroe. I slowly opened it. Memories, page after page. These memories include holidays, birthdays, and family vacations. Not a single picture of me, though. Not one. The memory of holding her hand at the seashore when I was 5 years old still lingers. Even my graduation prom picture, which she framed herself, is lost. Lost. As if I had vanished. As if I didn't exist. Silently, I closed the book and placed it on the table. They were unaware. They spent too much time discussing who would manage the estate, his bravery in raising a blended family, and how fortunate Olivia was to have a father figure like him. I felt like screaming. However, I didn't. I needed a breather, so I turned and went to the kitchen instead. I heard it at that point. Does she remain in the area? There was a whisper. Don't worry, my stepfather said in a quiet but firm voice. She will leave by the end of the month. I now own the house, Catherine ensured that. I went cold. With a clatter, the spoon in my hand fell into the wash basin. He was aware of my presence, and he didn't give a damn. Now I was only a visitor, a hassle. He had to resolve a technicality. Something inside of me changed at that very instant. I refrained from crying. I didn't go up to him. The rain pattered lightly against the glass while I stood there, staring at the window. I felt it in my bones for the first time in my life, as I saw my reflection weary, drenched, and forgotten. I had no place here. No more. He was unaware of what I intended to do next, though. My mom married him when I was 12 years old. I had no idea what to call the sensation in my chest at the time. Really, it wasn't hate, and it wasn't fear. It was more akin to displacement. As if no one had noticed me sliding away after I had been gently moved out of the picture. My mother adored him. That much was obvious. And I didn't blame her for wanting security, comfort, and safety after what she had to go through with my biological dad leaving in the middle of the night with only a duffel bag and a shattered dream. In Alan, she discovered that. That's how it appeared from the outside, anyway. He was endearing. He was adept at knowing when and how to say the right things, purchased flowers, made dinner. He always had a story to tell and a smile on his face. However, his love had limits when the doors shut and the lights went out. I never got it. He didn't hit me. He didn't shout. He didn't see me, though. It is more difficult to explain such a type of neglect. It's the lunchbox that has another person's name on it. You're constantly half out of frame in family holiday pictures. There is just one vacant seat in the throng when you look at the school plays yours, the one he never took. Instead of calling me by my name, he called me kid, or, occasionally, Olivia by accident. When I was 15, I once heard him declare, "She's not mine. I mean, I do my hardest, but, there's no actual connection." I never mentioned hearing that to Mom. I didn't want to spoil her meager enjoyment. I improved my ability to fold myself up, keep the passageway quiet. Cleanup is quick, always willing to lend a hand, always helpful, always attempting to avoid being a burden. I reasoned that perhaps one day Dad would look at me and see a daughter if I just did enough, like making the bed, getting straight as, and smiling when I needed to. He didn't. Rather, Olivia entered the scene. In legal terms, she was his niece. She moved in with us when she was 8 years old because her mother, Alan's sister, battled addiction. In an instant, the dynamic changed. She had a room of her own. He claimed that although I remained there till I moved out at the age of 18, I was briefly transferred to the smaller one. She was enrolled in ballet courses. I sacrificed my art classes to assist with babysitting. In the garden, she had a pony birthday party. I had a card signed by Alan and Catherine, along with a frozen pizza. No, Dad, never, Dad. Only Alan. But I persisted. When he failed to pick me up from school 3 days in a row, I remained silent. Because things are tight, I didn't complain when my allowance ceased. When he made fun of my attire and stated, "You look like a substitute teacher. You should relax," I swallowed my pride. And perhaps, just possibly, I was the issue, I told myself. I might not have been lovable enough. Raising them isn't easy enough. Insufficiently thankful. Not enough supply. That notion lingered like a shadow throughout maturity. It wasn't until I finally entered the light that I realized how heavy it felt. I only wanted to be seen, though, back then. I recall a specific instance. It was my high school graduation night. I had received one of the best scholarships in my class. I had composed a speech. As I stood at the stage with trembling hands, I noticed my mother in the crowd, grinning and crying. And beside her, a vacant seat. He hadn't arrived. He was watching TV that evening when I arrived home. Didn't raise their eyes. Saying, "Did it go well?" I gave a nod. "Nice," he remarked. "Could you please take out the trash?" I sobbed in the shower that evening, in silence, as usual. It had nothing to do with the speech, the prize, or even the vacant seat. It was the knowledge that I could do anything and yet remain invisible in my own house. Years went by. I went off to college. Held 2 jobs. I clawed my way back, struggled, and failed. Alan always made sure the assistance came with a guilt trip, although my mom helped when she could. He would advise you to understand how the real world functions. We're not an automated teller machine. However, for her 16th birthday, Olivia received an automobile. After that, I stopped requesting anything. Mom's phone calls decreased in frequency. It was because every chat felt like it was being watched, not because I didn't miss her. As if he were constantly in the background, observing and evaluating. I returned when Mom became ill. In order to care for her, I left everything behind, including my finances, work, and apartment, and moved into the guest room. I helped her to the loo, cooked, cleaned, sat with her for the chemotherapy, and held her hand during the nausea. Alan, too? He played golf. He offered justifications. He pretended to be a heartbroken man who was too exhausted to share in the suffering. I was the one holding her hand when she died on a Thursday morning. He didn't even shed a tear. People approached him at the funeral and complimented him on his strength. Well-loving spouse. A solid foundation. Nobody gave me a look, not once. 6 weeks had passed before the monument I entered at the beginning of this story. Sleeping in a house that no longer felt like mine for 6 weeks. Silent eating for 6 weeks. After 6 weeks of seeing him live, everything seemed to be the same. Loud TV, whiskey at night, Olivia coming to visit and laughter as if my mother had not passed away. Then there was that discussion in the kitchen. He said, "She'll be out by the end of the month," at that same moment. I now own the house. The last time a thread snapped was then. Not in a big way. Not with flames. I simply came to the silent realization that I could no longer shrink. There are no more parts of myself to share. That night, I stood outside the house in the rain, gazing at the window of the bedroom that had once been mine. And I asked myself, what am I doing? Why have I stayed here? How come I'm still waiting for a man who never wanted me to be more than a bother? For the first time in my life, I didn't cry that night. I walked to the bus terminal, packed a tiny bag, and spent hours sitting quietly and staring at nothing, simply breathing, simply being there. And I had a gut feeling that this time would be different. I had lost everything, and that felt like power for the first time. That night's departure was more than just a way out. It was the most subdued act of defiance I had ever committed. The door was not slammed by me. I left no note. I didn't make any requests. I simply left. 2 towns over, I reserved a room at a budget motel, the kind that featured flowered bedspreads and buzzing lights that hadn't been thoroughly cleaned in years. But I was able to breathe for the first time in weeks. Nobody spoke up. I was not ignored. Nobody pretended that I didn't exist. Pulling the scratchy blanket over my knees, I perched on the side of the bed and gazed at the TV, mute. I had nothing to watch, simply allowing the soft buzz to fill the void that trying once occupied. Alan wasn't called by me. I kept my whereabouts a secret from him. Olivia had always treated me more like a charity case than a sister, so I didn't even text her. I didn't use the phone. It was 3 days later. Next, a week. Nothing. No calls were missed. No texts inquiring about my whereabouts or general well-being. My departure had no effect on the home where I grew up. I learned all I needed to know from it. However, on day 8 or thereabouts, I received an email from the attorney managing Mom's estate. It was chilly.official. According to the completed paperwork, Alan Westwood is now the only owner of the property located at 213 Hollowbrook Lane. Catherine Monroe has expressed her desire to close her personal accounts. No specific heirs were mentioned by name. I went back and read it. But then again, not a single heir. Not even myself. She didn't give me my name, not once, not even as a marginal note. For nearly an hour, I sat still on the chair. A part of me wished it had been an error, that she was confused and intended to include me, that Alan had concealed records, manipulated things, or something. Anything that would mitigate its harsh finality. However, the reality was like ice in my chest. He was left in charge of everything. Every meal, every picture, and every blanket she used to give me when I was sick with the illness. The home, her jewelry, her life, to him. And I don't care. No justification. Don't apologize. Simply, quiet. All of a sudden, the past began to make sense. I dismissed all of those minor incidents as forgetfulness. She often averted her gaze when Alan acted aloof towards me. The manner in which she left less and less for me, and more for the family he desired. There was no plan for me. I was a leftover. That evening, I went for a stroll. I needed the air, but the motel clerk offered me a poncho and warned me not to walk far because it was raining again. I had to relocate. Just before it closed, I walked by a bookshop and recognized a face. Bellamy, Mrs., my former high school art instructor. She was still wearing her thick gray scarf and tilted spectacles as she browsed inside. It had been years since I last saw her. Something broke inside of me. I pushed the door open. Her eyes brightened as she turned. "Is that you?" I gave a nod. All of a sudden, I was 15 once more. I drew beside the window in her classroom, thinking no one would notice how tiny I was. That evening, we ended up getting coffee. She refrained from prying. Simply listen. She leaned back and said something straightforward that struck me more strongly than anything I had ever heard when I finally told her what had happened. Mom was gone. Alan's icy dismissal, the inheritance, the quiet. There were times when our parents didn't really see us. This isn't always the case. It's not your responsibility to make them appear more difficult. I blinked. It wasn't until she brought me a serviette that I realized I was crying. She said, "You were never invisible." Simply put, everyone around you decided not to look. That evening, I returned to the motel and sat there in the dark. That's when everything changed. Not a huge explosion, not a grandiose vow of vengeance, just some clarity. In the hopes that someone might notice the shape I was attempting to maintain, I had spent years folding myself smaller. I had finished it. I started not returning their calls after that, ceased to check in. I stopped wondering if I was on their mind, since I was aware of the solution. And I was set free by that. I began applying for employment again in the city the following morning. Moved into a studio apartment that was furnished with a kettle and a mattress, worked temporary jobs, saved money, and started from scratch. Every minor triumph seemed like a defiance. "Everybody, you're fortunate that we took you in. You're too sensitive. Why are you still furious about that?" It was years before I spoke to Alan again. But after 3 years or so, I happened to stumble onto it one day while aimlessly browsing through real estate postings. 213 Hollowbrook Lane, the house I grew up in, for sale. I spent a long time looking at the screen. I then broke into a smile. They believed I had left. They believed I had simply vanished. They were unaware that I was still observing. I'm still recalling. I'm still waiting. They were unaware that I was at last prepared to take action. I didn't immediately purchase it. I played it cleverly. No? As I double-checked my finances, ran figures, and spoke with a reliable real estate attorney, I saved the listing and had it open on my screen for days. Although I was far from wealthy, I did have funds. I had sufficient funds to make a down payment. Additionally, the first possessed something worth more than cash: patience. I held off for an additional 2 weeks. Next, 3. The cost decreased. There was no biting. And then I called one Friday morning. Using my married name, which I had adopted for a temporary position and preserved for secrecy, I said hello in a composed and businesslike manner. The property on Hollowbrook Lane piques my curiosity. Perky, almost too eager, was the agent. It's a beautiful house. Very endearing. The bones are sound, however, it needs some upgrading. She was unaware that as a child, I had trod barefoot on those bones, had slept in the smallest room with the groaning vent that whistled in storms, eaten dinner in that kitchen, and sobbed on those stairs. I kept it from her. Did not have to. The following day, I pretended to be a first-time visitor and took a tour of the house. I nodded as she pointed out the charming breakfast nook and the original wood flooring. I wanted to chuckle. The stories the walls could tell were unknown to her. In the hallway, where my handprint was still barely visible behind a coat of paint. When I was 9 years old, my mom and I carved a small heart into the back of the pantry door. Alan said, "She's just extra baggage," as I heard him say. But my face remained expressionless. Be calm. Detached. We went through the sleeping quarters. I have a sewing room now. The pale blue wallpaper with gold stars that I had chosen at the age of 14 was no longer there. Beige in its stead. Distant and frigid. I touched the windowsill with my fingers. "You like it?" asked the smiling agent. I gave a nod. "It is recognizable." She didn't inquire. The documents were signed 2 weeks later. When I sent the down payment, I didn't hesitate. When I got the closing documents in my mailbox, I didn't think twice. When I saw the deed transfer with my name displayed boldly and clearly, I didn't cry. I simply printed it off, put it in a folder, and stared at it. Mine. The house was once again mine after a decade. I wasn't finished, though. I didn't purchase it for sentimental reasons. I hadn't purchased it in order to make amends, re-establish a relationship with my mother, or recover a lost youth. I purchased it for a single reason, since I was able to. Additionally, they didn't believe I ever would. A few months prior, Alan had moved out. According to the agent, he moved to Florida. He moved to Florida due to post-retirement downsizing. Since then, the house had been deserted. Too many ghosts, probably, to get a good night's sleep. Excellent. The day following the closing of the purchase, I hired a locksmith. A brand new deadbolt set, doors with reinforcement. We have installed top-notch security cameras, lights that move. Everything is sleek and contemporary. Everything is safe. No more loose keys. No more unwelcome guests. Additionally, I changed the mailbox just for me, a small detail that only I would notice. The old one leaned sideways and was corroded and dented. I used an elegant black model, same location. The same figure. This one, however, was locked. That was crucial. I kept it a secret. Not even my few pals over the years who were aware of some of my background. This retaliation wasn't noisy. There was no drama. It was not intended for acclaim. There was silence, as if a steel door were gently shutting behind me. However, the ripples quickly began to appear. I received a call from an unidentified number a week after I moved in. I didn't respond. Next, a message: "Hello, Alan is here. I believe I have heard about the house. Can we have a conversation?" The voicemail caught my attention. Didn't remove it, didn't reply. Another one the following day. "Look, I believe that something went wrong. I didn't plan to sell the house just yet. I intended to give it to Olivia." I grinned. It wasn't out of joy, but from a deeper source. Strength, command, calm. For 2 more days, he called. Olivia then made an attempt. "That house wasn't intended for you, and I have no idea what you're doing." "Mom would never," I interrupted her message. Since I was aware of something she was not, it made no difference what they believed. I had received nothing from them. I had also retracted everything. I wasn't finished, though. Not quite yet, because I was going to do something else. Something that would guarantee they would always remember what they had done to me. Something definitive. I was also going to do it how I wanted, silently. Grinning. I received a knock on the door on a Tuesday afternoon. I had anticipated it. In the sunroom, which Mom had always spoken of converting into a greenhouse but never did, I was sipping tea. The floor, the cushions, and my hands were warmed by the light that came in through the large windows. There was silence, calm. And then there was a knock. Firm. Again. Not invited. I took a while to get up. Simply stood after taking a final sip of tea and staring at the door for a while. He was standing there when I opened it. Alan. 10 years older. Thinner. His appearance was not as polished as I had expected. His jaw was stiffer than I remembered, and his face seemed drawn. He appeared uneasy, as if he wasn't sure whether to grin or make a demand. "Hello," he replied, his gaze darting past me and into the house, as if he still owned it. I remained silent. He said, "I heard you bought it. I didn't initially believe it was you. However, when the locks failed, Olivia, she called me." I remained silent, though. He chuckled uneasily. "Welcome home, I suppose." I leaned against the doorframe with my arms crossed. "Be calm and steady. I'm tired of faking, not angry." "Alan, what do you want?" I inquired. He moved. "This situation seems unexpected. The family was supposed to keep this house." I arched an eyebrow. "And I'm not related?" He didn't respond. Rather, he looked behind me down the corridor. He told him it was all a massive misunderstanding, as if he expected to see my mother's ghost grinning. He claimed that she would have preferred Olivia to have it. "You mean the niece you pushed out the back door with, effectively adopting?" With a steady voice, I inquired. "Chilly." He winced. "It's unfair, come on." "No." I shut the door behind me and stepped out onto the porch. "Alan, you erased me. You removed me from the pictures, the will, and her funeral. To make yourself appear good? You took her life and turned it into something else, leaving me with nothing." "I didn't," I interrupted. "But you didn't even let me finish." "She had it at her disposal. At the house where I was raised, while the coffee brewed, she would braid my hair next to her at the table." He cast his gaze downward, quiet. With a firm voice, I went on. "I felt like a stranger because of you, as if I weren't worthy of grieving for my own mother." A long pause ensued. "There's only a bird among the trees and the wind." At last he spoke. "We all grieve in various ways, you see. Errors occurred. Selling the house without first consulting us is concerning. That's chilly. Isn't that cold?" It nearly made me chuckle. I said, "I owe you nothing." He became agitated. "Do you believe this to be justice? Purchasing the house without our consent?" "No," I replied. "The The situation isn't fair. This brings things to a close. Mine. I didn't get it from you. I took it myself then. His expression clouded. You did always believe that you were a martyr. No, I repeated. I believed that I belonged to a family. It was you who changed my feelings. After saying that, I pivoted. I didn't care that I could feel him yelling behind me. Calmly, I entered the house, closed the door, and carefully locked it so he could hear the click. The following day, Olivia arrived. She didn't knock, she pounded. Really, open the door! She yelled. You don't own this. I was supposed to own this house. I slightly opened the door, met her gaze. Not bothered, I responded. You've never truly loved this house. It smelt like soup and regret, you said. She stopped. She whispered, I was a child. No, I replied. He was unkind to you. And he taught it to you. She squinted. It's not yours to keep forever. I can, I said. I've previously replaced the locks. I have already submitted the deed. I now own it. Lawfully. Indefinitely. Scoffing, she shook her head. Do you believe that this improves you? No, I replied. However, it gives me freedom. I then slammed the door in her face. I mailed Alan one packet later that week. There was a picture inside. One of the few remnants of my mother and myself that I still had. With the beach behind us and the wind in her hair, she was grinning and holding me. She had a genuine appearance. She was flawed, fierce, and loving, not the sainted version they made of her after she passed away. On the back, I jotted down, You forgot her first love. I remember now. L. No address for return. No justification. A silent reminder of what he discarded. And I didn't hear from one of them again after that. I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. Not initially. The ensuing quiet was so total it nearly felt odd. No phone calls. Don't text. Don't knock on the door. No dramatic altercations. Simply be silent. I heard my own thoughts for the first time in years. And what caught me off guard the most? There was no more anger. I took a stroll around the neighborhood the day after I mailed Alan that picture. There had been little modification to the pavements. The pavement exhibits fractures. The hedges remain crooked and uneven. The same elderly man who, as if it were 1962, continued to wave to strangers across the street. However, I was unique. I went by the grocery shop where my mom and I used to walk. We would quarrel about cereal brands and ultimately wind up with both. I grinned as I stood outdoors for a while with my hand on the metal cart rail, not because I was depressed, only recollection. I sat with a cup of chamomile tea on the back porch that evening and allowed the quiet to envelop me like a blanket. It was no longer painful. It simply was. I received an email from a former neighbor 2 weeks later. Green, Miss S. When I was younger, she was nice. She gave me cookies through the fence. When I had no one else to talk to, she allowed me to pet her dog. She wrote, I've heard that you purchased the home. All I wanted to say was, good. You always belonged there. I didn't answer. I did, however, cry. Only once. From something else, not from pain. Perhaps relief. Olivia tried one last time a week later. She appeared in person early in the morning, looking like she had just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, all beige, with makeup on. I leaned idly against the doorframe and opened it. This time she didn't yell. She grinned. That syrupy, false sort. She said, I've been thinking. It was a bad start for us. I blinked. We were never in agreement. She disregarded it. I simply feel as though we are both in pain. Additionally, this house might be a shared memory. I'm not sure. For us both. I took a while to respond. I simply cocked my head to observe her. She wasn't here to make amends. She came to change the course of history, I said in a low voice. You never inquired about my well-being. This continued even after Mom passed away. Not when I vanished. Not when I was barred from her memorial. You weren't locked out by me, I answered in a cold voice. You erased me. And now you're smiling while attempting to cover up the erasure. She moved, but I didn't back down. Now that I've got what you wanted, you can't be polite. There was a little break in her countenance. I went on, I'm not here to exact revenge. I'm not here to cheer you up, though. A pause occurred. She parted her lips, then shut them. Then, without saying another word, he turned and left. I didn't see her again after that. I learned later that month that Alan was struggling financially. It seems that the downsizing was not voluntary. The pension has vanished. The investments failed. What about the condo in Florida? It was never intended to be his. Short-term rental. Short-term. I learned this information in a private discussion with the real estate agent who had marketed the house to me. Not from him. Shame, she said nonchalantly as she sipped her latte. He probably believed that location would sell more. However, buyers just showed no interest. You're lucky, huh? I simply grinned. Because it was not a matter of luck. I had waited, observed Dot expanded, and I moved like a lady who didn't need permission to exist when the time came. I repainted the house throughout the course of the following few months. Not for sentimental reasons. Not to make it the same way it was, but to claim it as my own. My mother used to sew curtains, which I took down and replaced with soft linen. I removed the beige wallpaper. Olivia had selected and replaced it with a blue color that was somewhat similar. In the backyard, I planted a garden. The garden consisted solely of rosemary, tomatoes, and lavender, with no fancy plants. The sort of things that had a homely scent without requiring a lot of care. I was watering the rosemary one day when I saw something odd. I had lost my anger. Not by any means. I wasn't anticipating resolution. I didn't think they would say sorry. I didn't require it, since I had made my own decision. At last. Around that time, I got back in touch with Elliot, a former coworker. At one point, we shared a small office where the printer was constantly jamming and the air conditioner never functioned. He was nice. Keep quiet. He listened rather than talked. He inquired about my well-being, not in a courteous manner, in a genuine manner. Additionally, he didn't provide answers when I gave him bits and parts of the events, not the entire tale, but enough. He simply gave me a coffee, nodded, and said, "You seem to have survived the fire. You're still warm, though. It's not common." After that, our conversation increased. Not about the past, regarding books, music gardens. Calm. He didn't invite anyone over. So I invited him one day. I didn't show him the rooms, so he didn't inquire. He didn't look for scars or stories. When the wind increased, he simply sat with me on the porch, gave me a blanket, and said, "This area seems to have been designed with healing in mind." I took a while to respond. However, I trusted him. I actually believed it for the first time. And I muttered as I glanced across the garden, "It no longer stung as much. The house no longer creaks as it once did. Perhaps it's the new flooring, the foundation repairs I made, or perhaps I'm the only one. Perhaps now I approach it in a different way. Lighter. I am more assured of my position." I didn't save much of the past. A picture of my mother with a coffee mug on the ledge, grinning at the camera. The picture is a faded painting I did when I was 6 years old, depicting a sun that resembled a fried egg with clouds made of crayon. Tucked away in a drawer I hardly ever open is one of her scarves, the purple one. The others? I gave it up, because I've discovered throughout the years that forgiving isn't usually the first step towards healing. It appears to be boundaries at times, similar to quiet. For example, changing the locks to feel safe in your own space, not out of spite. My mornings are slow these days. I get up early to avoid the light rising too high, and I go through the kitchen barefoot while making coffee and listening to the birds outside the window. I take my time. I'm not concerned about being noticed, accepted, or selected. I no longer want a seat at the table, since I constructed my own. It's a little one, constructed by hand from oak and purchased from a nearby craftsman. Usually a book is on it, a candle. When I remember, there are occasionally fresh flowers. And I can always find a seat. Only me, not as a visitor. I am not acting as a last resort, but as my own life's host. I still occasionally run across Alan, but not voluntarily. Once at the farmer's market, once at a petrol station. He suddenly appears tiny. Emotionally, not physically, though time has taken its toll. He exudes an aura of ancient pride and unfinished stories. When he sees me, he remains silent, does not wave, simply looks aside or acts as though they are unaware. It hurt once. Right now, I feel nothing now. He made his decisions. I did the same. Every now and then, Olivia's name is mentioned. She briefly returned to town, according to a friend's friend. claimed she appeared worn out, claimed to be divorced. I didn't request anything more. I don't have to find out what transpired after the door shut. I no longer own that portion of the story. Elliot continues to come. Not every day. Not in a grandiose romantic manner. Just enough. When I've been working in the garden for too long, he stops by with soup, brings me odd teas from tiny stores he discovers while traveling. While I journal, he reads on the porch. We talk occasionally. We don't always. It's simple. It's warm. Additionally, it doesn't ask for anything that I don't freely provide. I seem lighter now, he said once. Not quite happier, but more complete. I believe he is correct. Because joy isn't a significant event. Sitting in a house that used to haunt you and discovering that the ghosts no longer speak is what it is. It's about feeling happy and not lonely while sipping coffee by yourself. It's hearing and ultimately enjoying the sound of your own voice. Over the years, I've given my mother a lot of thought. What she did, what she didn't do. She may not have loved me as much as I needed, but she loved me in her own way. It's not simple. Grief, however, is always there. I used to dream about her, those horrible, overly vivid nightmares in which she returned, and everything was normal. She would often apologize and give me a hug during these dreams, where she asserted that I was more important than he was. The dreams have changed since then. She occasionally appears, discreetly seated on the other side of the table. She cooks occasionally. She doesn't always say anything, however, I always awaken with calm rather than pain. And that's sufficient. I would have laughed if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be back here, in this town, in this house, and in my own skin, or sobbed, or both. However, it's odd how life tends to fold in on itself, of giving you second chances in locations you vowed never to visit again. Echoes still reverberate throughout this house, but they're mine now. My song, I laughed. My decisions, I didn't receive the appropriate apology. However, I provided myself with the necessary closure. And that? The true triumph was that? Therefore, if you've ever felt alienated inside your own family, if you have ever remained silent in order to maintain harmony, in a room full of people who were meant to love you, if you've ever stood silently, recognize this. You're not by yourself. You're not broken either. Peace is something you deserve. You are deserving of a place at the table. What happens if they refuse to provide it to you? Construct your own table and shut the fucking door.